Chesed off top of the page. Hareini Nazir Kisa'ar Roshi. So we saw this Gemara already yesterday. A guy says, I'm a Nazir like the hairs on my head, Ka'afar Ha'aretz, like the mud on the ground, Kollel Yom, like the sand of the beach. Hareza Nazir Olam, he becomes a permanent Nazir. However, when we galech achas l'shloshim yom, he cuts his hair once every 30 days. What does this mean? He's constantly living in a cycle. For every drop of sand on the beach, he has to keep one cycle of Naziris. Effectively, he's keeping Nazir cycles for the rest of his life. Okay, Rabbi Yemer, Ein zeh megalech achas l'shloshim yom. Rabbi disagrees. Rabbi says you keep one long Naziris. You don't keep this. You don't keep multiple Naziris. What's the scenario according to Rabbi where you need to keep multiple Naziris? Where he says I'm accepting Naziris like the hairs on my head, but saying I'm a Nazir like the hair on my head, that is not enough. Etc. Okay. And the idea here is, like we said before, the reason why you become multiple times a Nazir is because these things are considered incountable. Now, I'm sure somebody's counted the amount of hairs in somebody's heads. It's got to be some researcher who's wasted enough time.
Average number of hairs.
Yeah, to come with the number.
It's a shorter task of duration for some of us than others.
Yeah, fair enough. I'm sure there's a number to it, but the idea is that it's considered too small to have a finite number to it. If there was we'll see if there was a finite number, and if it was capped by a specific amount of time, then we say that the Nazir is actually that amount of days. And we'll get to that in a moment. Okay. Hareini Nazir Malay Habayis, I'm Malay Akupa. A guy says, I'm a Nazir as big as this house or as big as this box. Well, what exactly does that mean? But can I say you check the box? Im Omar, if he says, Achas Gedola Nazarti, he says, I made a big Nazirus as big as this box. So what does that mean? It means 30 days, Stam Nazirus. And he's saying it's as difficult as this large item. However, Vimar Stam, but if he didn't say, he didn't say the size of the box, so then you say Ryan is a kupa ki'ilu himalaya chardal. You fill up the box with mustard seeds, which is a box of mustard seeds considered incountable. It's just not practical to count, and therefore, it's one Naziris for each mustard seed, which is effectively an infinite cycle of Naziris. It becomes a Nazir for the rest of his life. And we'll soon see the Gemara. The Gemara wants to know, well, why are you filling it up with mustard seed? Fill it up with watermelon. There's a lot less are going to fit inside, right? And even and like this with watermelon, either it's going to be it'll be in two categories. Either it will be less than 30, because how many a box that can hold 30 watermelons is already a pallet. It's quite large. So if it holds less than 30 watermelon, you're Nazir for 30 days. And even if it's a huge box, so it holds 120 watermelon. So he's a Nazir for 120 days, but not 120 cycles. The difference is because a box of watermelon, even if it's a pallet, so how many watermelon are in a pallet? 50, 100, whatever it is. Some countable number. It's not that many. And because it's countable, remember, therefore it goes into the day category. It does not go into the cycles of Naziris category. The cycles of the Nazir's category is reserved for things that are uncountable, like the amount of hairs you have on your heads. Okay. One second. Okay. Hareini Nazir Mekan Ad Ba complaining. If a guy says I'm a Nazir from here until there, you evaluate Kama Yom Mikan I'm complaining. How many days does it take to get from here to there? In Pachas Milamid Yom, if it's less than 30 days, Nazir Lamid Yom, he's a Nazir for 30 days. V'im Lav, if it takes longer than 30 days, Nazir Kaminyan Hayomim, he's a Nazir for the amount of days it takes for him to get to that point. Hareini Nazir Kaminyan Yimaisachamo. Somebody says I'm a Nazir like the amount of days in a year. So what does the Gemara say? Mine Nazir is Kaminyan Yimaisachamo. This is an interesting one. we hold that he counts one Nazir for every single day of the year. So what's 365 times 30? Obviously, the answer is 30 years. So he's going to go through Nazir cycles for 30 years. One second. Rav Yehudah supports the opinion of the Tanakama, and he says, Ma'aseh, there was a story that this happened. Kivan shehish lameis, and he accepted Naziris for 30 years effectively, and when he completed his Naziris, he passed away. Okay, and the reason why this scenario is different is because he says communion. He counts. He says, "I'm becoming a Nazir like the number of days in a year," which means one Nazir for each day. This really is a number that how many days are in a year is a limited, finite number. But because he says I'm a Nazir for each day of the year, communion, so therefore he becomes a Nazir literally for each day. Okay. So the Gemara says, "Royan es a kupa." You look at the box, as if it was filled with mustard. V'nazir kol yamav, and therefore, in effect, he becomes a Nazir for the rest of his life. As the Gemara of Amayin, let's imagine it was filled with watermelon, or acorn squash, right? So one of those, it's very, very large. To have a decanto, and therefore there should be a solution here because he doesn't become a Nazir for the rest of his life. He becomes a Nazir based on the numerical quantity of watermelon that fit into either the box or the house. Okay, Amar Chizkiya. So Chizkiya said, "Machlekes shnuya." This debate is regarding an already established machlekes. What's the machlekes? Machlekes is if somebody becomes a Nazir, but it's not clear if he actually became a Nazir. Well, let's see the Gemara. A person will put himself in a position where the doubt is more severe than certainty. What does this mean? The Tanya we learned. A guy says, "I'm a Nazir if in this basket, in this silo, there's 100 core worth of tvuah, worth of grain." So he looks at a major silo. He says, if there's the volume of 100 core in this silo, I'm becoming a Nazir. Sure enough, what happened? By the time he gets to the silo, somebody stole it. Doesn't know how much was in it. He found it was stolen or lost. So now you don't know, is he actually a Nazir or not? So Shimon says he's a Nazir. Because we have a doubt, and therefore we have to be stringent. There's a big problem here. If you're a Safek Nazir, how do you end the Naziris? You can't end it, but typically Nazir ends his Naziris by shaving his head and bringing sacrifices. Problem here is, if he's not a Nazir, he can't bring the sacrifices because those sacrifices aren't sanctified. Mm-hmm. They're non-sanctified animals because he's not actually a Nazir. So what's the solution? Okay, so we'll get to it later in the Masechta, but in a nutshell, you do it like this. The guy says, I'm becoming a Nazir now if there wasn't 100 core in the silo. Because if I didn't become a Naziris for my statement about what the volume of grain in the silo was, now I'm a Nazir now. And if I was correct, then I'm not a Nazir. So therefore you have either way you go. If there were actually 100 core in the silo, so then he accepted his first Naziris and not the second Naziris. And if there weren't, the first Naziris is invalid because there weren't 100 core, and the second Naziris is valid. And now, either way, he's able to bring the sacrifices. However, there is a problem still. You don't solve all the solutions, because what happens if it becomes tamei before he has a chance to make the statements? So then he's really stuck, because in order for him to purify himself, he needs to bring 3 sacrifices. The problem is that he can't bring those 3 sacrifices because maybe he was never a Nazir.
He becomes Tomei after he made the first
Before-
statement?
After he makes the first statement, before he makes the
Before
second
the
statement.
second statement, okay.
So then he has to go through the ceremony to purify himself, but he can't. And therefore he remains the status of a Nazir who became impure, but we're not actually sure if he's a Nazir. So basically he has to grow his hair and not drink wine for the rest of his life. He could become tummy though, because he's never purified himself. Okay, so Reb Shimon says that this is ultimately what he made this statement, and even though treating the statement even though we have a doubt and we have to treat his statement as if it's doubtful. In other words, we don't know if he became a Nazir, and even though treating it with doubt is more severe than actually becoming a Nazir, because in Nazir you have an in, you have an out. Over here, you don't even have an in really. You're a suffix Nazir, and there's no out. There's no way to get out of it, especially if you became tummy. You're stuck for the rest of your life. Nevertheless, ultimately you go by what he said, and this is the statement he made, and it's just too bad. However, Rabbi Yehudah matter. Rabbi Yehudah says he's not a Nazir at all. Shesafik Nazir is lahakal, because Rabbi Yehudah is makel in such a scenario. Rabbi Yehudah presumes that had he, since his accepting of a suffix Nazir is more severe than an actual Nazir, we presume he never intended on accepting a Nazirus that would result in a scenario of suffix, of doubt. We don't know whether he's a real Nazir or not. It's because that situation is more severe than Nazir itself, and therefore, he would not have accepted that. Okay, 1 second. Okay, so therefore, the Gemara is saying that we view, in other words, we could fill this box with mustard, or we could fill it with watermelon, right? We don't know what to fill it with. According to Rav Shimon, you're gonna be machmer. You'll fill it with mustard instead of filling it with watermelon. Okay, so that concludes the first segment of the Gemara. Next segment of the Gemara, I hope I don't trip over myself. I'm coming mostly from the art scroll and the Rosh. I could not understand Taisus's explanation here. Okay, and that is as follows. Rabbi Yochanan says, Afilu tema Rabbi Yehudah, even if you'll say this is the opinion of Rabbi Yehudah, Hasam lenochas le lenaziras. Okay, as follows. In Rabbi Yehuda's argument, Rabbi Yehudah is saying that what's the doubt in Rabbi Yehuda's scenario? Whether he is a Nazir, whether he isn't a Nazir. Over here, the question is he certainly is a Nazir. The only question is how long is he a Nazir for? And therefore, you don't have the rule of Rabbi Yehudah. Rabbi Yehudah would agree in such a situation, if you're not sure how long the Nazir is, you have to be machmer. Okay. There's just one problem now. So how do you end it? In other words, because on one side, let's say he has a big silo, it holds 1,000 watermelon, right? 1,000 watermelon is still not the length of Naziris of millions of cycles if you fill it up with mustard seed. So can the guy cut his hair or not? If he did the mustard seed thing, so then he can cut his hair every 30 days. If he did a long cycle of 1,000 watermelons, then he has to, his Nazir is going to be 1,000 days long. So the Gemara says, what do you mean? It's a simple solution. Why can't we end the Naziris immediately after the first cycle? Let's look at the box. Let's say it's a small box, or it's a big box, but it doesn't hold even, it holds 30, maybe a little bit more watermelon. So he keeps the first Naziris, which is 30 days long, because it holds 30 watermelon or less. And then let's say as follows. Now let's analyze what he said. In context, what actually he said is, do I want to become a Nazir or do I not want to become a Nazir? If he said he wanted to become a Nazir, he's finished his Naziris now. He's finished his first Naziris. He doesn't do any more cycles if he meant watermelon. If he meant sesame seeds or whatever, mustard seeds, which is even smaller, then he has to keep on going forever. So now it is a question of whether he accepted Nazirus or not. In other words, we're saying fundamentally, Rabbi Yehudah says that if he accepts Nazirus, if the doubt is whether or not he accepts Nazirus, no Nazirus. Nazirus is kula. We're lenient. But in this situation, after the first Nazirus, it's exactly what we have. Once he keeps the first cycle of Nazirus, the question really is it one? Is it done, or is it continuing forever? So it's exactly relevant to review the scenario, and he should be a Nazir for. In other words, it's a question: did he accept multiple cycles? Did he accept one cycle? Which is the same as did he accept Nazir or didn't he accept Nazir? And therefore, because ultimately the question is: are you in effect a forever Nazir, or did you end it now? And you're saying that the doubt here is going to be more severe than the actual certainty, which should mean we should be lenient. So Gmara says, hold on a second. Okay. Gmara says, "Lo yisakadai from zero to the kibbutz." Don't. Okay, so in other words, if even so, until now we're saying that the chard of the mustard thing is multiple cycles of Nazirus, right? Obviously, we saw in the Mishnah that Rebbe disagrees, right? Because Rebbe says the only time you'd have to do multiple Nazirus is if you specifically said multiple Nazirus. Otherwise, we don't presume that. So now, the Gemara here is switching. The Gemara is saying that Rabbi Yehudah holds like Rebbe, that you do only one long Nazirus. So Rebbe says if you fill the thing with mustard seeds, you're a forever Nazir. And in other words, you're a permanent forever Nazir. You're not a Nazir that has to do multiple cycles. It shaves his head every 30 days. So therefore, Rabbi Yehudah holds like Rebbe. And now what's the doubt here? Did he become a 30-day Nazir or did he become a forever Nazir? One second. Okay, so 1 second. Okay, so I believe the question here is that in this scenario, we're going back to the Gemara's first teretz. In other words, according to Rabbi Yehudah, what's the suffix here? Whether he accepted Nazirus of around 30 days, maybe it's a little more, certainly not less, depending on how many watermelons you can fit into the box, or he accepted a forever Nazirus. So now it's certainly one Nazirus. It's not multiple cycles. So there's no, so therefore, Rabbi Yehudah says, look, because certainly he accepted Nazirus here, we're just not sure how long it is, you have to be stringent. In the beginning of the Gemara, he was doing multiple cycles. So after cycle number 1, it's all versus nothing. Over here, it's never all versus nothing, because at the first question, is it a small or is it a big one? And therefore, in that scenario, Rabbi Yehudah says, be machmer and take the big Nazirus. Because Rabbi Yehudah only says you can be makel when it's an all versus nothing. But over here, it's not, because it's not a nothing. In other words, because Rabbi Yehudah never says it's multiple cycles, it says it's one long cycle. So therefore, according to Rabbi Yehudah, you would have to keep the long cycle. Okay, so Rabbi Yehudah goes like Rabbi. It's time we learned in the Mishnah. Rabbi says in the scenario of the box, you don't shave your head every 30 days. Who's the one who does? he has to specifically say the word Nazirus. In other words, he doesn't say I'm a Nazir like the amount, like the hair on my head.
Mhm.
He says I'm the amount of Nazirus like the hair on my head.
Yeah.
Okay, so Rebbe holds it, and basically, therefore, in the scenario of the chardal of the mustard seed, he's a forever Nazir, not a multiple cycle forever Nazir. So the Gemara says, hold on a second. Rabbi Yehudah misavar l'karebi. Does Rabbi Yehudah agree with Rebbe? It's the case that he doesn't agree with Rebbe. Why? Because if you look at the end of the Mishnah, we learn, but not a guy says, I'm a Nazir, the amount of days of the year, right? So what do the rabbis say? He's a Nazir for each day of the year. Right, 365 times 30 years effectively. One second.
Have that many cycles, or it's
That many cycles. Every 30 days a new cycle for 30 years. 1 second. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yehudah misavar law Rebbe. I'm sorry. Amar Yehudah says, Ma'isa haya v'kivan shehesh lameis. Rabbi Yehudah basically is bringing support here to the rabbi's position that there was a guy who did this and he kept 30 years worth of Nazirus, cutting his hair every 30, shaving his head every 30 days. V'kivan shehesh lameis, and the conclusion of the 30 years, Meis, he passed away. Okay, now if you say that it was multiple cycles of Naziris, that he completed the multiple cycles, the word hashlama makes sense. Me have a hashlama klal. Is the word hashlama, like multiple payments, appropriate? Like he completed his payments. There's no payments, it's one big payment. Evidently, Rabbi Yehudah holds like the rabbis that say it was 365 days worth of Naziris, and Rebbe disagrees, because Rebbe would say that in that scenario, it's a one Naziris that's 1 year long. Another point that he doesn't agree with Rabbi. About Tanya, we learn Rabbi Yehudah Aimer. Rabbi Yehudah says, "Hareini Nazir minyan hilakti kayetz." So basically, toward the end of the summer, they're drawing out some of the figs. They put them in these small piles. The guy says, "I'm a Nazir." The amount of Nazirus I am is the amount of piles there are in the field. Uminyan shibole shmita. I think this is the piles of weeds of Shemitah. Is that how the article translates?
also the big group or the number of Shemitah paths.
Shemitah what?
Paths.
Got it.
How many?
Got it. In other words, because they don't plant the field, so then people walk through the field. In other words, because the field is not planted, so everyone's walking through. So you have, I don't know, tens of whatever, however, a large amount of paths through the field. So guy says, I'm a Nazir, one for each path. So what do? You count how many piles there are, of figs there are, or how many pathways through the field there are from Shemitah, and you count that amount of Naziris, that 30 days times that number. So evidently, Rabbi Yehudah disagrees with Rebbe. So Gemara says, no, he doesn't disagree. Minyan shiny. Rebbe would agree that if you say the word minyan, number, that's the same as saying Naziris. Then a unit of Naziris. In other words, Rebbe would agree that in this scenario, it's one Naziris for each type. So the Gemara says, but that's not the case. And we shine the Rebbe minyan. Does Rebbe hold that the word minyan makes a difference? But Tanya, we learned, Hareini Nazir k'minyan yimaisachama. The guy says, I'm a Nazir like the number of days in a year. My Naziris k'minyan yimaisachama. He counts Naziris 365 days. Kimei halvana, like 29-day lunar cycle. Mine kimei halvana. He keeps the minimum, which is a 30-day cycle. Rebbe says, if he says the number of days in a year, he keeps 365 cycles of Naziris, or 29 cycles of Naziris, like the moon. Rebbe Aimer, no. Rebbe says you have to say the word Naziris. In other words, I'm accepting one Nazir for each day of the year, for each day of the lunar cycle, 29 days. Ukaminiya by Salvano. Rabbi Yehudah several. Okay, so evidently it's clear that Rabbi Yehudah and Rebbe have a strong disagreement in whether or not somebody who uses a number, if you don't use, according to Rebbe, the only time you accept multiple cycles of Naziris is if you say so. Use the word Naziris. According to Rabbi Yehudah, there are many other situations like the number of. I'm a Nazir, the number of days of a year. It means you're a Nazir for one cycle for each day of the year. So clearly there is a debate between Rabbi Yehudah and Rebbe. So how could we say that our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehudah is going with Rebbe? He seems to disagree with him. So the Gemara says, you're right and you're wrong. Rabbi Yehudah he agrees with him in one and disagrees in the other. What does that mean? He agrees with him in one category. So someone can say B'chada. Chada Nazir is Kibbalah, meaning that in other words, Rabbi Yehudah agrees to Rebbe in the scenario of the mustard box that it's one long Naziris. But he disagrees with him. He has more expansive terminologies for when you would say multiple cycles of Naziris. Rabbi Yehudah says if the guy says minyan, the number of, that in effect refers to the number of cycles. And Rebbe says no. Minyan does not refer to the number of cycles, it refers to the length of the Naziris, unless you say the word Naziris. In other words, the number of cycles of Naziris as, days in a year, days in a month, etc. Rabbi Loishan, okay. We together?
Good.
Okay. So,
Solve this whole problem by having a little booklet on if you say this, it means this.
yeah. Okay, let's finish the paragraph. Now, turn our bottom. The rabbis taught, Hareini Nazir kol yemei chayai. Somebody says, I'm a Nazir for the rest of my life. Or he says, Hareini Nazir oilam, I'm a permanent Nazir. Hare is a Nazir oilam. He is a Nazir oilam. What's a Nazir oilam? Like we said, we'll call it a Nazir of Avshalom. That means that you can lighten up your hair every probably 30 days. There's some debate about that. Let's say he says, Afilu mea shana, afilu elef shanim. If the guy says 100 years or 1,000 years, ein ze nazir olam, el nazir le olam. He's a standard nazir that lasts forever. Tanar Rabbanan, Hareini nazir va'achas. I'm a nazir and one. Well, what does and one mean? And whatever it means, but it's at least a minimum of another cycle. So it's 2 cycles of Naziris. Let's say he says, Hareini nazir va'achas. Void. I'm a Nazir and one and another. So how many Naziris is that? Minus shalosh. You count 3 Naziris. Let's say he says, how many Nazir va'achas void v'shuv. I'm a Nazir and one and another and again. How many Naziris? Mina arba. It's 4 Naziris. Well, pshita. Well, you kind of think it's obvious at this point. So Mars is married to him v'shuv. V'shuv means again. Kikulu. V'shuv means again another set of 3. So a guy says, I'm a Nazir and one and another, and do it again. Maybe and do it again means not do it again a Nazir, do again a unit of 3 Naziris. So you should actually have to do 6 cycles of Naziris. So the Gemara, the Bryce here is telling me that no. Again means again another Nazir, not again every word prior to that, meaning another 3 cycles. Okay, Tanar bottom. Hareini Nazir. Oh, this is for Charles. You'll enjoy this. A guy says, I'm a Nazir. Simcha says, if you use the word hain, now all these apparently are Greek words, so I'm not an expert in Latin. If the word hain, now obviously it would be in or some, the hay sometimes is a Hebrew accessory to a word. Hain means achas, it means one. In Greek, the word one is sometimes used with the word hain. If he says digun, that would be shtayim. That's the Greek number for 2. Tirigun, that's sholosh. That's 3. Tetargun, arba. That's 4. Puntigun, pentagon, is chamish. Is 5. So if you use any of these words associated with Naziris, that's the number of cycles that you have to do. Tanar Rabbanan, the rabbis taught. So we have we spoke about this briefly the other day. We have the spiritual affliction called tsaras. It looks like modern leprosy. or maybe it doesn't, but it presumably probably looks somewhat similar. It's a spiritual affliction that not only afflicts human beings, but it can also afflict houses. Now, the rule is as follows: if the house is a round house, there is no, there does not have the laws of mitzvah. So if a guy wants to make sure his house never has any spiritual afflictions, he just builds it round.
Wow.
Let's say it's digun, it's a two-walled house. I guess the third side is exposed to the elements. I have no clue how to do that. Yes.
Are they going to explain at some point why building the house round gets you off the hook in that regard?
Yeah, we'll get to it.
Okay.
You need four walls, and we'll soon see it. We'll explain why in a moment. Digun, if it's a two-walled house, also no tsaras. If it's trigun, if it's a three-walled house, also not. Puntigun, right? If it's that building in Washington D.C., no nigam there, right? No spiritual affliction in that house.
Good to hear it.
What was that?
That's a relief.
Yeah, can you imagine? Otherwise, it would require releasing classified materials. The kind would get to see what's going on there. Okay. There is no tum of nigam. In other words, the house might get a spiritual affliction, but it will never need to be torn down. It never becomes impure. Tatargun, but if it's a four-walled house, mitam nigam, then it can receive. It can become tameh and need to be destroyed if it gets a spiritual affliction called tsaras. Okay, my time. Why is this? Somebody asked that question.
Yep.
Lamata huaymer. In one of the verses it says kira and kiros. Hold on. There we are. Second. Okay, the word kiros plural is used twice. In both situations, it's extra. Kiros is plural. Kiros means the wall of the house. So the plural of a wall is two. And if it says it twice, the minimum plural of two plural words is four walls. So it needs to be exclusively a four-walled house. And that concludes the first parak of Masechtas Nazir. Thank you.
Team, go state.
What are you saying?
I said, yay, team, go state. First chapter, Dan. Well, what's the situation on the date for our Nidorim?
I have to work on it. It was going to be next week, but then something came up next week, and I was waiting to work at that. It's like next week is busy. The week after that's busy. I would say probably the 19th.
Would it be okay just to do it at a Kiddush of Shabbos?
You want to do that?
Well,
Joint sponsorship.
My presence is always sorely needed at a big.
Oh.